Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Rafter, chair of the 2023 ASJA Virtual Annual Conference. Welcome. We are so excited you are here. The conference committee and I have spent the last 5 months planning what we think is one of the best lineups of sessions and speakers ever. Sessions you can learn from, speakers you can relate to, be inspired by, and maybe even get some assignments from. Writers work in a time of change. It's causing us to question everything that we do, the topics we cover, the people we talk to, the tools that we use to do our work. It's appropriate that this conference is happening in June, which is Pride Month, and also when we celebrate Juneteenth. One focus of the conference this year is how to do better at including historically underrepresented groups in our work and in ASJA. We're thrilled to have 9 scholarship recipients joining us who represent members of those groups. Today's keynote speaker is going to say more about how to recognize the unconscious bias that can stop us from being more diverse and inclusive in our work. Writers today are facing other challenges. In Hollywood, writers are striking for better compensation in an industry that's changing because of streaming services. Freelancers and book authors are dealing with new business models, whether it's models based on generative AI writing tools or shifting avenues for how to get a book published. We are looking forward to spending the next 3 days talking to you about all of that and more. A few housekeeping notes before we get started with the program. ASJA staff will be on hand to provide support at every session, and you can contact them through the chat or talk to them in the lobby chat, as I see a number of you are already doing this morning. I also want to say, please be sure to stick around for today's virtual happy hour at 6:30 Eastern, 3:30 Pacific. ASJ President Emily Paulson is going to share some ASJ updates and news, and then preside over a very fun cocktail and mocktail contest. So be sure to bring your favorite recipe to share. That's it for me for now. I will be in the lobby chat throughout the conference if you have a question or you want to say hi. I also want to give a shout out to our fabulous ASJA staff, who we could not have put this on without, and also to the members of my conference planning team. Now, here's ASJA Vice President Lisa Roepe to introduce today's keynote speaker. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Hi, thank you, Michelle. I'm really looking forward to the next 3 days. They're going to be really exciting. In addition to being ASJA's Vice President, I'm also the chair of ASJA's Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility Task Force. And for the next hour, we will discuss the roles writers play in supporting diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility efforts. We can support these efforts with the topics we choose to write about, the sources we interview, and the language we use in our writing. This keynote will be in 3 parts. First, Janet Stovall, ASJA's DEI&A consultant, will speak for about 20 minutes. Then Janet and I will have a conversation. And then the last 20 minutes will be reserved for your questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A. Janet is global head of DEI at Neural Leadership Institute and the founder of Pragmatic Diversity, a DEI consultancy. She's also co-author of the Amazon best-selling book, The Conscious Communicator, The Fine Art of Not Saying Stupid, SH*T. In addition to being an author, she's also a speechwriter and a scriptwriter. So take it away, Janet. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It is my pleasure. Thank you for having me. And I'm looking forward to talking to you and then talking to Lisa and then just hearing what everybody has to say. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And if you see me looking around, it's because I have 4 screens here that I'm working. So let's see if we can get it shared. Okay. I'm assuming everybody can see my screen. Okay. All right. Let's go. This is me. And I need you to understand that for me, speaking out, communicating has never been a problem. And any platform would do, whether it was a table, a sliding board, and eventually even a real stage. But for much of the time that I spent my life speaking out, I was doing just that. I was speaking out, not speaking up. And they're not the same thing. Speaking out is spontaneous. Speaking up is studied. Speaking out is communicating, it's communications. But speaking up is conscious communication, or at least it should be. The reality is that when you're talking about issues that are tricky, like racism, sexism, gender, identity, politics, religion, diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice, it is really, really important to communicate consciously. Because when we don't, stupid stuff happens. And basically, there are 4 ways, 4 variations on the theme that most of us encounter a lot in our writing. The first is something I like to call the searing slur. Now, that's what happens when we stop listening or we fail to care about what others think, be it ideas, criticism, or even general opinions. Let me give you an example. A few months ago, maybe last year, a leader at a large restaurant chain sent an email to all his colleagues, and he was celebrating rising gas prices. What he was thinking was that if the prices went up, people would come back to work because they need to have jobs. And then the company could hire employees at a lower wage. That was just totally insensitive. But he communicated that because he wasn't conscious about it. And we've all seen that happen. The second type of unconscious communications you might run across is what I call the clueless comment. Now, I don't think any of us in our right minds would ever intentionally insult anybody with the things that we write and the things that we develop. At least not those of us who like getting paid on a regular basis, we wouldn't. But sometimes when you're in a hurry, you got a deadline, you got to get something done, you just go off the cuff. We just say what we think we know. We operate on expediency. That's usually when we find out that we really don't know as much as we think we do, and that we really didn't do maybe as much research as we should have. Times like that, we say things that are just not that great, that are really thoughtless. I'll give you another example. Zoom meeting. CEO of one of the largest banks in the United States. He exasperated his entire Black staff when he said, you know what? We are really having a hard time reaching our diversity goals because there aren't enough qualified minority candidates out there. Now, we know that not to be true, but he just said it. He didn't think about it. It was thoughtless. It was clueless. The third one you come across is what I call the dismissive dart. That's when you just throw it out there. It's a big disconnect. You don't think about what you're saying. It's downright offensive. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen. I'm assuming none of us would ever do that. And then finally, there's a thing that we see more of all the time, scared silence. That's where we don't talk about things that are difficult because we're just afraid. We're afraid to say the wrong thing, offend the wrong person. And that's a loss because we are the front line of social justice. We are the communicators. This is something that we have a responsibility and a great opportunity to be a part of, but it requires being a conscious communicator. And that's not always easy Because the truth is, some of us have probably done some variation of any of these things. And it's not because any of us are bad people or bad writers. We're simply biased people, and we're biased writers. So let's talk a little bit about that. You've heard the terms implicit bias, unconscious bias, explicit bias. They're all very different, but just basically the easiest thing to remember is this. All bias at some point is unconscious. Implicit bias is unconscious. Explicit bias has aspects of being unconscious. However, we've changed the way we think about this. The scientists who came out with this in the early 70s will tell you that they're very sorry that the words bias and implicit bias ever slipped into common parley, because we don't really understand. Cognitive bias is that bias that you're born with. It's a bias that makes you see a snake and jump away from it just instinctively. And a lot of organizations like to talk about cognitive bias. I happen to work for one that does that. The reality is cognitive bias is not the one that's going to make a difference in terms of discrimination and prejudice and stereotyping. That's implicit bias. Best way to think about it is this. Cognitive bias is what you're born with. It's a function of being human. It's the shortcuts we take so that we don't have to think every decision we make in life. But when you take cognitive bias and drop it into society with all the things that make up a society and all the things that make up the communications between people, that's when you get implicit bias. Implicit bias is a form of unconscious bias. Now, we used to think of it as unconscious thought, and that gave a lot of people a bit of an out. I don't know how many times I've heard people say to me, well, if it's unconscious, then I'm not responsible. To which my response is, I just told you it was unconscious, so now you're conscious, and so yes, you are. But the reality is that research has advanced a little bit now. And so what we believe about implicit bias now is that it's not unconscious thought. It is automatic behavior. The behavior that happens that you don't even think about, that is triggered by something that you may or may not be unconscious of. And those triggers are societal triggers. And note, I say may or may not be, because sometimes we know fully well what we're doing. Sometimes we write things and we know fully well what we're writing, but we're writing from a place that is biased, that we don't even understand is biased, but we know that what we're saying is not quite true sometimes, but it's just what we believe. Because the truth of the matter is, we experience the world, each of us, differently. And we believe that what we experience is objective, and it truly is not. Because the thing is, we are always being driven by triggers that we may or may not be conscious of. Society shapes us, and we respond automatically. But that's the good news, because if it's behavior, it can be changed. And as communicators, we really need to think about how we do that every day. Well, let's think about this. Where does bias even come from? Well, it can be shaped by a lot of things: culture, life experience, lived experience. And social media has been a great exacerbator of bias. It actually can take bias and make it go viral. But it comes from all those places. We have to remember that if we live in the world, even if we don't live in the world, if we just function, we lived in a cave, we have bias. It shapes our experience. It is shaped by our experience. And it definitely, definitely shapes what we write and what we create. Where does it show up? It shows up everywhere. It shows up from the very beginning when we start creating. We stereotype. We underrepresent certain groups. It shows up when we measure and analyze. Algorithmic bias is a real thing. The data and the algorithms that we use to create or curate content often result in promoting certain perspectives and suppressing others. And while we're talking about that, let's just talk a little about AI. AI is huge. I don't know about you, but I've played with ChatGPT. I've let it write a couple of memos for me, and it's great. But what's interesting is the other day I decided to do my usual, not just use ChatGPT, but challenge ChatGPT. So I gave it a prompt. I asked it to write me a very short social media post about the backlash against diversity, equity, and inclusion that is happening in my space, the backlash. It wrote a nice little post. Then I came back and said, now write it as if it was coming from a chief diversity officer. It wrote another post, did very well. Then I told it, write it as you would if it was coming from a Black chief diversity officer. All of a sudden, instead of greetings, it was, hey fam. All of a sudden, it was y'all, it was ain't. It was things like, it actually ended with a quote from the ancestors. Now, I was going to write a post and say, well, ChatGPT is racist. My daughter explained to me that no, it is not. ChatGPT and all the AI out there is really just a bunch of really fast, not so intelligent research lackeys. Takes what it sees and it makes definitive statements based on partial and biased information. Kind of like what we do. The reality is that AI simply replicates historical marginalization. We have a chance to not be that. We have a chance to interrupt that. The third place that you will see bias show up is actually in consumption. And by consumption, I mean what audiences perceive and how they interpret what we write. And that can be influenced by their own background. So recognize that bias gets exacerbated. We bring it to our work, we put it in front of people, and they read it through their own biases. How do we stop this? And what, better yet, what does it actually do? What does it actually do to us? What does it do to our audiences? Well, I can tell you very simply, it does a lot and none of it's particularly good. For us, it can be creative limitations. Unconscious biases can help us miss opportunities for fresh perspectives and insights because we're sitting behind our biases. It can lead us to be exclusionary. It helps us perpetuate the stereotypes and exclusions of certain groups. And it has a lot to do with just basically lost potential. When we don't check our biases, the things that we do are less impactful. We don't reach our audiences. We don't reach audiences that we could reach. People don't hear our messages. They only hear our bias. And speaking of that, speaking of audiences, what's the effect on them? Well, you can expect their engagement to be reduced. Audiences, all of us, we disengage with content that doesn't resonate with us. If it doesn't speak to me, if I don't see my experience in it, I tune it out. We all do. It reinforces biases. If we have stereotypes in our work, it reinforces the implicit biases that the audience has. We exacerbate that bias. And then it does real harm. Because if you think that it is harmful to people because of their bias, imagine what that does for the people who are normally biased against. When members of marginalized groups lack positive representation in general, and what they get from us as writers who have the opportunity to change it is more bias, not a lot of them look forward to, is there? We have the ability to change the world. We just have to figure out how to do it. The bottom line is this: bias is why stupid stuff happens. So that being said, what can we do about it? Well, let me tell you one thing. We can't eradicate it. It is a part of being human. But we can start by accepting, first of all, that it exists. Accepting that we all have it. Yes, you do. You do. Because until we do that, we can't interrupt it. Because the reality is this: bias just means you're human. Bias doesn't mean you're bad. It just means you're human. At the Neuro Leadership Institute, we say if you have a brain, you have bias. But the reality is, interrupting and unlearning this bias makes you a better human, and it certainly can make you a more conscious communicator. So how are you going to do that? It's pretty simple. Question everything. Everything. All the time, every time. Ask yourself how you know something to be objectively true. Ask yourself that. And then seek a different truth. Challenge yourself every day to learn something different and new, to see something different. And if you don't really have a way to figure that out, for heaven's sake, just ask. I volunteer right now as tribute. If you got a question, ask me. There are plenty of people out there who want to hear from you, who are part of your groups, who want to be asked these questions. Some days they don't. You know, that it is our job as communicators to educate ourselves. But sometimes, if you're not sure, find that person to ask. The person who's most harmed, could be potentially most harmed by what you say. And if you don't have anybody in your group, maybe it's time to get some new friends. Maybe it's time to expand your networks. Okay. But once you've questioned everything, Once you've uncovered your truths, don't stop. It's time to activate those insights. It's time to take this new perspective that is a little bit less biased, still biased, but it's a little bit less. And every day it's a little less of that. Every day it's a little bit broader, it's a little bit wider. Take it and do something. As I said earlier, we as communicators are on the front lines of change. We always have been. That means we have a significant responsibility. It's up to us to fix a lot of things, but it also means that we have a wonderful opportunity. And for me, I'm proud of that. We all should be. We just have to make sure that we use that opportunity and lean into that responsibility the right way. One way that I'd like to help us do that is using something that I worked with my co-author, Kim Clark, to create, called the depth model. And it's the basis of our book, The Conscious Communicator. It is an objective way to look at issues, to think about what you're going to say on issues that might be a little tricky, specifically if they have to do with diversity, equity, inclusion, or social justice. Because as communicators, we usually just know sometimes when something is wrong, especially if the issue is a touchy issue or tricky issue, we know. But sometimes our own bias can hinder our professional intuition a little bit. Sometimes there's somebody else pulling the strings. Sometimes we have a paycheck on the line and we just got to do what we're told. Well, what we need for ourselves and for those people who are asking us to do things that maybe we don't think is right is an objective way to look at very subjective issues. We need an objective way to apply consistently a specific, repeatable, defensible way to identify whether we should talk about it, whether we should step in, step down, or just step away. That is why Kim and I created the depth model. It gives you a way, it challenges you for any issue. If there's something that you think your bias might be there, it challenges you to take these 5 categories and to ask yourself a question about each one of them. Ask yourself, if what I'm about to communicate, is it deliberate? Do I have a clear goal that I can articulate for why I'm going to step into this? Is it educated? Do I know all that I could possibly know about this? Is it purposeful? Does it align with my mission, my vision, the mission and vision of the client that I'm doing the work for? And is it tailored? Is this an issue that I can help move the needle on uniquely, or I can help my client move the needle on uniquely? And finally, is it habitual? Is it something that we've talked about before, we're ever going to talk about again, or intend to address at any given point forward? The depth model is a way for you to interrupt your bias, uniquely designed for communicators. Do that, and you can interrupt your bias. Do that, and you'll communicate consciously. Do that, and we have an opportunity to change the world. In closing, and before I get to a conversation with Lisa, I'm going to take the words of Ralph Ellison here. If the writer exists for social good, and I believe we all exist for social good, then our role is that of preserving in art those human values which can endure by confronting change. We have the opportunity to create that change, to drive that change, to help people endure, and those human values endure. We just have to start by checking our own bias. Thank you. Now I'm going to stop sharing the screen so I can have a conversation with Lisa.
Hi, thanks, Janet. That was really great. I really feel like you broke that down pretty well and made it really digestible. And I know there were some things that I was hoping to have a conversation with you about.
Okay.
And one of them was, I know that you worked on this popular TV show, I think it was on Netflix, Cobra Kai.
Cobra Kai.
You put into practice this idea of uncovering, questioning, and redirecting bias. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience with that?
Okay. Well, first, I hope that nobody here really loves Cobra Kai, because personally, when I got told I had to do this, I told them they need to give me hazard pay. I had to watch 5 seasons of Cobra Kai, and I decided that was just cruel and inhumane punishment, but I did it. Because this project was this. The company I work for, the Neuro Leadership Institute, is a believer that you change organizations by looking at how the brain works. And so there's a solution that Neuroleadership Institute sells that's designed to deal with unconscious bias. So when I came to NLI, I wanted to start in February, but they kept pushing me to start in January because of this particular contract. It was with Sony Pictures, and we were going to teach bias training to the creative team for Cobra Kai, the showrunners, the writers, the people who make that show. And the interesting thing was, I came in and I was the first DEI person that was a full-time DEI person that NLI ever had. And I sat down and I said, okay, I understand the issue of bias when you're talking about business decisions, people decisions. I said, but how do you mitigate bias when you're talking about creative decisions, which is the work we do? Because at the end of the day, in some instances, being creative is about bias. If you're a fiction writer, bias is your job. If you are a casting agent, bias is your job. So how is it that you mitigate bias in that space? And that was the question we raised. We ended up having to rewrite our entire solution. But what we told them was, sometimes you have to be biased because that is what the story or the plot tells you have to be. But within that bias, ask yourself, am I being negatively biased? The question you always ask yourself is, if I'm choosing to be biased, am I doing it consciously? If I'm doing it consciously for a reason, then it takes the story forward. But I need to understand why. I'll give you a quick example. In the first season of Cobra Kai, there was a scene where Cobra Kai is a story of the Karate Kid when they grew up. If you're familiar with the Karate Kid, this is when they became adults. So the guy who was kind of the bad guy in the original Karate Kid is a grown-up man now. He's a drunk, and his father, Ed Asner, shows up at his house, and Ed is old and has a caregiver with him. So the caregiver is a Black woman. She's got very typical Black features. She's got short hair. She's got big earrings. She's snapping her head. She's snapping back. She's sassy. And I remember looking at that saying, and then I looked, okay, so does this woman show up anywhere else? She doesn't show up ever again, anywhere in the whole 5 seasons. So my question to them was, okay, why could she not have been a redhead who was 20? Why did you choose that role? Why did you choose that person? That is one of those situations where the bias was not necessary. And think about what the story arc could have gone in had they done something different instead of going just that route. Instead of picking the Black woman as caregiver, they didn't do it. So that's what we did with Sony. We by the time we got done with them, we said, look, you've got a hit TV show. You're not going to do much with this one. But what we want you to do is every time you step into this, question, why did I pick this person? Why am I taking the storyline? Why am I setting it in this place? And I know that sounds like a huge lift, but once you start doing it, it becomes habitual. And once it becomes habitual, that is how you break down bias.
Great, thank you. That's a great example. I know we have some questions that are coming in the chat and also in the Q&A. I'm keeping an eye on the chat, but please put them in the Q&A so I don't miss them. I have a couple more questions I want to ask Janet, and then I promise we will go to your questions because people are asking some really great questions.
Great.
But I did want to ask you, Janet, I know that, as you said in your presentation, we all say stupid things from time to time. And I was wondering, if we do say something stupid and we realize it, what is the best way to make amends?
If you say it out loud to somebody and you're aware that you've done it, immediately apologize. But the first thing you have to do is you have to listen to the person who's been harmed. And that means not trying to reframe it. You don't get defensive. You don't make it a microaggression by telling them it's not too important. Intent does not matter. Impact does. So the thing about this funny about bias and about inclusion is this. Bias happens in your head. Inclusion happens in the other person's head. So you may think you're doing something inclusive. You may think you're saying all the right things. You may have the best of intentions, and it could go very wrong because bias. And If that happens, the thing to do is to stop. If that person says something to you, even if you sense that it's weird, stop, acknowledge what happened, apologize. And then depending on who you're talking to, ask, what did I do wrong and how can I do better the next time? Sometimes that's not going to work for you because it depends on what you said, depends on when you said it, depends on what the situation was. Sometimes that's not the answer you're going to get. But always, if you don't do anything else, acknowledge the hurt and apologize for the harm immediately.
Now, you mentioned microaggressions.
Oh, yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about what those are? And also, if we see someone being microaggressive, I don't know if that's the right word, but if we see it, how do we stop it?
One thing we should always realize is this. Everybody has privilege at some point, at some time. And I know that some people and some groups of people have more privilege more of the time, but we do. I can't see people's hands raised, and I'm not sure who's on the call, who else on the call, but I'm gonna throw this question out here. I'm gonna teach you about privilege. Okay. If you're on the call and you know who the Divine Nine are, put it in the chat. And I can't see the chat, so Lisa, let me know what you're seeing if anybody says anything. The Divine Nine.
I know what it is, but I'm not going to give it away. And I know what it is because you told me, and I'd not heard of it before.
I see the yup. I saw the black drinks.
Damon Brown knows what it is.
Somebody put in there what it was. Yep, here they come. And see, I can tell just by looking at these responses, I can guess. And it's biased. It is some bias, I know, but I can guess what the racial identity is of the people who are doing this. I can be wrong, some of them, but it's probably pretty good. What I want you to think about is this. If you know who the Divine Nine are, and you were in a meeting, let me explain. If you didn't get the chat, Divine Nine are the traditional Black sororities and fraternities. You've seen, AKA, Delta, Alpha, Kappa, Omega. I mean, I know I missed some Zetas. I know I missed some. Don't yell at me. But and if you didn't know what that was, I want you to think about the fact that if you were in a meeting, the people in that meeting would have privilege. People who don't traditionally have privilege. That's a small thing. So I say that to say that we always have privilege, and some privilege is situational. That being said, if you are in a situation where microaggression happens and you see it, immediately look at your privilege. If you have privilege in that space, that is when you can be an ally and you can address it. Now, you got to have common sense. Sometimes it's so egregious that it needs to be called out right there. But remember, we said microaggressions is not even a good word. The scientist who kind of coined that term, Dr. Daryl Wang Su, says he doesn't even like to call them microaggressions anymore because it's not micro. There is proof that consistent chronic microaggressions that happen against certain people in the workplace actually have an effect on their health. They call it weathering. It affects you. So they're not micro. They're not minor. They're big. But that being said, if you see it, and if you happen to be having the privilege that day, address it. If it doesn't make sense to address it in that meeting, you address it outside. And the way you address it is not to go to the person and say, look, what you said was really, really wrong. The better way to do it is say, what you said, this is how I felt when you said that. You make it about you, because number one, you don't know how that person felt that was the victim of the microaggression. You don't really know. You know, it probably didn't sound good. You had a good idea probably if they didn't say anything, but you don't know. And you don't want to make it worse for that person. You don't want to put them on the spot. So you go to that person after. And if that person happens to be somebody who shares your privilege, that is incredibly powerful, because what you're saying to them is, this is how what you did made me feel. Not how did they feel, how did I feel? And you suddenly then are talking as equals. And it either works or it doesn't. But the bottom line is, the reason microaggressions are micro is because for the most part, they are unintentional, kind of like biases sometimes. And the only way to make people get intentional is they have to know what they've done. And sometimes people don't even know. But now there are those people who are habitual microaggressors. That's a whole different category. That's when you call HR. That becomes an HR problem at that point.
All right, one more question from me, and then we're going to go to the audience. How can a longtime ASJA member like myself be more welcoming and a better ally to new members who may join a committee meeting or a chapter meeting, particularly when it's a member who may not share the same life experience as me?
The first thing you don't do is, there's two things you don't do, and you don't do them simultaneously. You don't pretend that diversity doesn't exist. You don't go colorblind or any of those things. You don't pretend that. But at the same time, you don't tokenize. And I know I just gave you two opposite things to do. The right place is somewhere in the middle. It is acknowledging that diversity exists and that it's valuable. Not just that it exists, but it is valuable. But recognizing that at the end of the day, we all have some kind of diversity. I had to chew our CEO out on a call one day because he said something about, this is a diverse person. I said, okay, see, this was microaggressions, probably not a good career move to, call your CEO out on the middle of a webinar. But the minute the webinar was over, called him up. I said, don't ever say diverse person again. He said, why? I said, that's a redundancy. Everybody's a diverse person. There are groups there are groups of people with diverse individuals in it, but everybody is a diverse person. So part of what you want to do is recognize your own diversity. Recognize that there are things about you. You can be a white, cisgendered, able-bodied man, which we think is the one who has no diversity, and you have hidden things. You may be neurodivergent. You may be gay. You may have depression. We don't know that everybody has something about them that nobody knows, and maybe they don't even know themselves. If we can start accepting that and understanding that we are all have some aspect of diversity, we are all diverse, it should give us the ability to take a little bit of perspective on those other folks. So full circle back to your question. If we lean into our own difference and ask ourselves, how would I want to be drawn in when I'm different? And typically the best thing to do, I think, is to find out what that person is good at. What are their superpowers? Where can their diversity best be leveraged? Because if you start thinking about it that way, you can create a role for a person that is unique. Now, when we create those roles, role clarity is incredible. But role clarity is not just for the person, it's for everybody else too. If you're going to bring somebody in who's different, you don't put them in a role and then ignore them. You don't put them in a role and then have people talk over them. You don't minimize them. You make it very clear, this person is here. This person brings value. This person brings a unique perspective. And damn it, we're going to listen to it. And we're not just going to listen to it, we're going to leverage it. We are going to do that. I've worked with the ASJA, the team, we've worked on several things together. And I've just been thrilled that sometimes I'll say something and I see everyone on the call go, oh, I hadn't thought about it that way. But what's even better is I'm watching those things then get manifest. They go into the work. That's how you do it. You let that person know that they're valuable because of who they are. And that includes everything about them. And then you find a way to let that value be leveraged, because then people are really included.
Janet, I'm glad you mentioned the work that you're doing with us. I don't know, I should have mentioned that Janet was very much involved in the selection of the scholars. The selection was based on criteria that Janet helped us come up with, and she was very active in the meetings we had. So Janet, you've really made your impact, and I think you'll continue to make an impact on ASJA as we continue to work with you this year.
I hope so. Y'all are my people. I'm one of you.
So we do have a lot of questions. So I really want to get to them. The number one question that keeps coming up, how do we find diverse sources?
That's always a fun one. Let me ask you this question. If you wanted a particular type, let's say you want Chinese food, where are you going to go? You go to a Chinese restaurant. If you're looking for diverse sources, you go where they are. There are lots of professional organizations where, first, let me clarify what you mean by sources. Do you mean sources to develop content with, to give you advice on things? Sources for what? If you're looking for people to talk to, they're out there. You got LinkedIn. Part of it is, I'll go back to that leveraging thing. Ask yourself what it is you're solving for. First of all, what am I solving for? What is it that I need to know? What is the perspective I'm seeking? And then you just start looking, because when you start looking for that, the diversity will probably come. And if it doesn't, if you say you're solving for something and you go looking and there's no diversity, that's your flag that you need to be looking somewhere else. So sources, it depends. It depends on what you're looking for. But nowadays with the internet, there's not too much we can't find. It is all about being intentional in the search and saying, I intentionally want to do this. I had a discussion with somebody on our team at NLI the other day. She says, you know what, I hate to say this, but we don't have a lot of men here. Is it okay to say, for example, that we should be trying to get more men? And I said, well, are there things that we could uniquely have a male perspective on that we want? Well, yeah, then yeah, we need some men here to do that. And that doesn't mean they can't do everything, but you certainly want to do that. So you want them for that. It's about figuring out what were we solving for, not just do we want people of color, do we not want men? What are we solving for? For us, part of what we're solving for is leadership development. Who's the majority of leaders, whether it's fair or not? The majority of leaders in the Fortune 500 are men. So as much as we think we're the smartest women on the planet, we do ourselves a disservice. But we don't start with saying, let's just hire some dudes. We say, what is it that we're solving for? And if you do that, you will find your way to your sources, I believe.
I agree with that. You know, I've gotten more and more comfortable over time being very specific about saying, I am looking to speak with a Black person, or I'm looking to speak with a Latina person. I used to be really uncomfortable about that, but I've really embraced it. And I will say, no one has ever said to me, oh, I can't help you.
Yeah, no.
People actually want to help if they know what you're looking for, it seems.
Yeah, because you get tired of seeing stupid stuff. So it'd be very nice to just ask somebody. Before I came to NLI, I was a speechwriter for the CEO of UPS. And I remember on Black History Month one year, I didn't know what they were doing. It was some of the PR group. And that I actually created the diversity comms function at UPS. So I was kind of doing that role. And I walked past the conference room. I saw a bunch of people there, didn't think anything about it. And then one of the guys on my team said, were you invited to this meeting? I said, no, what is it? He said, for Black History Month. I looked in the room, I said, this Black History Month, you all do realize there's nobody Black in this room, right? And the room just got silent. And I said, simply ask. I said, I'm curious about what you were going to come up with if you had not asked it, had I not just strolled past, but there was a Black person in the room. And the thing is like, that was simple, just ask. Nobody's going to get offended if you say, can you come help us with this? What is offensive is when you do something stupid and you haven't asked somebody. The trick is when you ask, listen to the voices. Listen to people when they tell you their truths. It's one thing to ask and just say, okay, check it out the box. It's another thing to ask, question, learn something new, and then activate your insight. That's what changes things.
Okay, I have another question. It's kind of long. I'm going to read it.
Okay.
Woke or wokeism is a hot topic. Journalists cover it because politicians campaign on it. However, the term originated with stay woke, a phrase used in conversations between Black people. Now it's used to be liberal or supporting the LGBT community. Can you address how omitting Black people from a conversation they started can be the worst form of exclusion?
It stinks. But if you think about this, what is the most effective way to stop progress? You take the language and you turn it around. You weaponize it. And that's what woke did. Woke got weaponized. Now, I don't know why they picked that one, but they took a word and they weaponized it. CRT, critical race theory. Who knew what that was? They weaponized it. So that is a very effective tactic. Yes, I think it's ridiculous that it was a word that was part of the Black community, but there's so many things that have been taken from different cultures and co-opted and then turned around, to affect those people. Sometimes we reclaim them. Sometimes we reclaim those words. I'd like to see us reclaim woke. I mean, I would. It's like, you know what, just take it back. And of course, when I hear people talk about being woke like it's a bad thing, I'm like, so what's the alternative? Asleep or dead? I'm sorry. I'm okay with woke. I got a problem with that. And but somebody put in the chat, queer is a word like that. Exactly. Queer is a word that I didn't read the whole thing. This has been reclaimed. Absolutely. We have some others that have been reclaimed. They're a little bit more controversial. I'm not going to bring them up here, but we know what they are. And but people will take your words and twist them. And that's exactly what they did with woke. But it absolutely started in the Black community. And it was a positive thing.
I have another long question.
Okay.
Given the complex interplay of social, cultural, and historical factors, how can we journalists of color, the person who wrote this is Mexican American and female, who may have internalized certain biases as a result of living within systems that often marginalize our voices, become more aware of and actively work to dismantle these internalized biases? Furthermore, how can we effectively leverage this self-awareness in order to promote more nuanced, equitable, and inclusive storytelling in our work? And by the way, that person identified themselves in the question, and that's why I included their identity.
Absolutely. Internalized bias, whether it's internalized racism, sexism, whatever it is hard because it does limit you. It does weather you. It's a terrible thing, but it's a completely understandable thing. There's no way you function in this world as a marginalized person and you don't internalize that. You do. It's hard to get past it. People talk about imposter syndrome. And I always laugh at that because I don't know too many Black women who have imposter syndrome because it's really not a choice. You don't have time for it. We have been impostered, but no. But the thing is that it is a source of strength. It's damaging and it's hard, but it can be a source of strength. Because if you've internalized that bias, you recognize that bias, you know what it is. The trick is to mitigate your own internalized bias the same way you mitigate implicit bias everywhere else. You have to question everything. There's something you're thinking, I can't do this, or I'm not unique, I'm not able to speak on this, or I shouldn't be here. Ask yourself why. Why should I not? And the best cure that has been for me anyway, for internalized bias is to say, what if I flip it around and use it? So if you're Latina, and that means that if you are Latina in this society, there's been some stuff that you've had to work through, some things you had to deal with, some stuff you've internalized. Flip it back around. Think of it as a superpower and figure out how you can leverage it. It's amazing what that can do. But yes, it is a very real thing. And, I have community. We work it out a lot of times in community and talking to each other, but I really have. Turning it into a superpower has been the best thing in the world for me. And so I let people know, I'm an expert on this. And it makes you tired sometimes. You're tired of being the expert, but everybody knows I've embraced who I am, and I see value in it. And it doesn't mean some days it's still hard to get up in the morning, but use it. Use it. It is a unique power.
And then another person asked, as writers, how do we appropriately use the term people of color? When is that term appropriate and when is it inappropriate?
I don't like it, but I've accepted it. I don't like it for a couple of reasons. First of all, if you say people of color, you're centering whiteness, because people of color as opposed to not of no color. I mean, that's, I don't like that. People of color lumps very different people and very different cultures together under one thing. just because you're, and besides, what color are we talking about? But just because you are brown, that means nothing. I mean, there are differences within each group, Black people, Latinos, Hispanics, there's difference there, period. And we certainly don't have the same issues and face the same challenges as each other. We don't even live within our own groups. So I don't like it. However, I understand why we use it. We use it because sometimes there are issues that are universal to those who are marginalized, and it's shorthand. Generally, what I try to do is, you're not going to write African American, Hispanic American, Asian American, You're not going to write all that out. First of all, as Maya Angelou says, why is it everybody who's not white in this country has to have a hyphen? Okay, we'll let that go. But anyway, so unhyphenated, we're not hyphenated. But I prefer to ask myself, what am I talking about here? And can I just name who it is? I'll give you an example. When the NAACP issued the travel alert for the state of Florida, somebody in our organization wanted to send an email to our Florida team to say, we are here with you. We understand, we understand this is hard and want to know that we are thinking about you. So the first thing they did was they came up and they took the part of the statement that the NAACP put out, and it said something about people of color. And then they started talking about diversity. I said, no, we're not doing that. I said, if you can't say Black people, then don't do this. Because it was the NAACP who issued this. And yes, they did talk about people of color, but they did not say that the travel ban was for people of color. The travel ban was for Black people. Name who you're talking about. If a tragedy has happened and you have to communicate about it, if it was the Asian community that was affected, you don't talk about people of color. You don't talk about everybody else. You name who it is that you center whoever it is in the moment, whenever you can. Sometimes you can't, but I usually only use people of color if what I'm talking about is truly universal to those who are marginalized, and it's something that everybody faces. If it's not, then I try to name whoever it is I'm talking to and about.
Someone asked, if the idea is not to be colorblind, what are your hopes for the future regarding the ways people think about, talk about, and participate with each other?
We got to stop equating color with bad. It's that simple. If Black were not bad and white were not good, if we didn't have that issue, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Colorblind says to somebody that who you are, I don't see. You have to be privileged to be colorblind. You have to be privileged enough to tell somebody who probably values what it is. And I know there's some people who are going to tell me, well, race is a construct. Absolutely it is, but it's a very effective construct. And it's a construct that has, over time, and being as embedded as it is, and with all the negative things that get attached to it, all the problematic stuff, has shaped people a certain way. Some of us like that. Some of us are proud of those things. So we don't want you to be colorblind. If you tell me you're colorblind, you're telling me I'm invisible. So no, we don't ever want to get there. What we need to do, though, is look at difference and value it. Because you wouldn't look at, for example, somebody who had a very unique talent. You would look at an artist and say, yeah, that's nice, but I'm art blind. It would be an insult because what they're doing is something amazing. You want to see it. You want to experience it. You want to value it. You want to hype it up. You want to do all that. It's the same thing with color. Color matters to those who wear it. It isn't always an easy thing to wear. And for that, we don't want it ignored. So the way we work together is we recognize that everybody has value. We recognize that some people have a unique value that other people don't have, and that all of it together makes us better than what we are. There's a term for it in neuroscience. I'm gonna mess this term up. Is it complexity theory? There's two things, complexity theory and generative interaction. Complexity theory says basically the whole the whole is bigger than some of its parts. Simply, we are complex people with complex processes with complicated people, and together we do more. And interactive and generative interaction is about how, when we interact with that complexity, we create something bigger than what any of us could do individually. So that's when we start recognizing that and start valuing and start recognizing and valuing difference. We won't have to worry about being colorblind. We'll be very color aware, because it'll be a good thing.
Great. We have 4 more minutes. I have one more question.
Okay.
And we may have time for one more after this. So if anyone has another question, put it in the Q&A. Someone said that they have had instances of microaggressions directed at them in membership organizations. And they want to know, when is it too late to do something about it?
It's not too late as long as you're still there. As long as you have found something that you value, that makes you want to stay, it's not too late. As long as you believe it's an organization that wants you there, and maybe it's individuals that don't, or as long as you believe that you want to be there and that it's something that you can benefit from, you stay and you address it. I mean, I recognize that power is a real delimiter. I mean, if you don't have power in a situation, saying that you're going to address a microaggression is really not that great. You'd hope somebody else would leverage their privilege for you. But at the end of the day, if you choose to be there, if you're going to stay in a space, change the space if you can, if you feel like it, if you're up to it. But I think it's never too late as long as you choose to be in that space. Because if you don't do it for yourself, you're doing it for somebody else too. But do it for yourself. Make that a space that you want to be in. Never too late.
Janet, if members have questions that they just didn't feel comfortable raising or think about later today or during the conference, is there a way they can get in touch with you? And I don't want to become a burden for you, but I would love it if there was a way they could interact with you, maybe on a, not going overboard, but if they have a burning question.
Well, my email's on the screen, although I would advise you that if you want the answer anytime within your lifetime, email's not the best, because I'm pretty bad about checking that. But the best way to do is just reach out to me on LinkedIn. I am very active on LinkedIn. And if you send me, if I'm not already connected to you, which I may be, and you don't have the one that lets you send a message, just send me a connection notice. You know, I'll know, ASJA, I'll know. Or if you really don't want to do LinkedIn, just send me an email. I just can't promise you'll get the email answer quickly, because I have like 4 email boxes, and I'm not the greatest at monitoring those, I admit. So, but if you send it, I will eventually get it. I will eventually answer it. I'll answer anything. Happy to.
And aren't you on your way to give the keynote to another major organization? I
am. As soon as we get out here, I'm going to run upstairs, throw my suitcase in. I'm going to SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Managers in Las Vegas. And I speak there tomorrow about the business case and the moral case for DEI.
Which is a very important topic right now.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, thank you. I have to say, this is our first session, so I have no idea who I turn it over to. But thank you, Janet. Thank you for all the great questions from the audience. And wow, what a great way to start the next 3 days. I am so excited. Thank you.
Have a wonderful conference, and I'll be checking on you from the road. Take care, everybody.